Welcome to everyone, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to see as people continue to come in, people from all across the United States. I don't know that I've seen anyone from outside. Did see someone from Canada, so still in North America. So glad to have you with us today. Um, Let me please share who's working with me today, my colleagues. Jessica, Lovett, Audrey, and Matt will be your team for the day, and we look forward to being with you over this time to share with you about improving worship. Let us begin with the word of prayer. Gracious God, we're so thankful for this day. We're so thankful for these participants who are looking for ways to connect people with you. We ask, Lord, that you would open all our hearts and all our minds so that we can better help people to know the love of Jesus. We ask all of this in your son's name. Amen. During our time together today, you will have, of course, the presentation. I'm going to briefly review some of the results from the survey that many of you participated in that was in our Leading Ideas e-newsletter. And at the end, your questions. If you could please put your questions in the chat, and that will give Matt a chance to compile them, and we will answer as many questions as we can during our time together. And any questions we can't get to, we will make sure to try and email answers out for you. Resources you will receive later. We will provide you with the full survey results. We know many of you are interested to know what others have said to the questions. We will also provide you with the slides, and we have put together a resource list that will help you as you think about some of the ideas we will present. And of course, you will receive the webinar video recording. Let me begin and get things set up for us by first sharing with you that we're going to use a non-sort of technical definition of worship and think about it as helping people experience God's transforming love and the importance of doing this as we help people to connect with God. We also want you to know that there is no magic wand for increasing worship, that it is hard work, and that we know that it's going to take effort, even with many of the ideas we'll present. So we want to be upfront to say there's no magic wand for increasing worship. But what we do want to share is that it is going to require a new mindset in how we think and approach it. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit, both from the perspective of some of the data we receive from what you yourselves have said, and then give sort of a big overview as we move into what Lovett and Jessica will present. So let me begin with sharing a big overview. As many of you know, most of us are familiar with what we call the attractional model of worship. One of my favorite movies is Field of Dreams, where they talk about build it and they will come. The attractional model is a sort of come and see, that we want people to come to our buildings. We try to put together the best worship experience for them. And we do this by focusing on the preaching. We focus on music. We may focus on liturgy, but the idea is that we want individuals to come to us. We want to attract them to our worship experience or service, and we are constructing this as an in-person experience in the building. Because of the struggle that many had in attracting people to the building, people start thinking about what we call a missional model of worship. And in a missional model, some examples are Fresh Expressions or Messy Church. These are more organic, and they don't necessarily depend on attracting people to the building. Missional models can take place out in the community. Some examples of these may be a coffee shop ministry, Christian yoga, but the idea is that we are not going to simply try to attract people to our building. We're going to try and focus on mission and go to where the people are so that we can do worship with them. As we think about the pandemic and just sort of the pivot almost all congregations had to make. Almost all congregations had to do some form of a virtual worship. Most congregations use Facebook, some use Zoom, but the idea was that worship had to continue, and it continued in a virtual model. This virtual model, again, we started thinking about sort of an attractional model in this virtual component. How do we attract people to our virtual component of worship? This could mean either streaming it live or taping it, but the idea was, how do we get people to watch it, or how do we get people to view it later? So the idea was to attract attenders to our worship service. But even with this model, there is still some looking for a missional approach, thinking about, are there ways we can still do sort of small group gatherings that are more organic? And many individuals found ways to do sort of coffee gatherings or something on Zoom that were more creative, that were small groups, that were still more missionally focused than simply the live stream of worship or taping it for people to watch later. As we think about moving into the day, most congregations are going to need a hybrid approach. Most congregations aren't simply going to be able to rely just on in-person, and they're not going to simply be able to rely just on virtual. That they're going to have to think about doing both of these things, and they're going to have to think about both attractional and missional models. It's not going to be an either or choice in doing this. They're going to have to do both of these things as they think about moving worship forward. Let me share some of the survey results to help you understand why it's going to be important to think about integrating these things. In the survey, and this is no surprise, that the number of churches broadcasting their hybrid worship services on YouTube and Facebook increased during the pandemic. And you can see the move from pre-pandemic to during the pandemic to the present time. That's still high. And even in the future, people are still believing that this is going to be an important part of the worship experience. So we go to the next slide. What we did see, though, is a decrease in the number of people doing online worship only, so that during the pandemic, there was a sort of height of online worship only. It has decreased during the present. You see in the future, there are some people who are thinking about maybe doing it more, but still it's going to be very low. But the slide that I think really is important for us today is 8 out of 10 respondents said the in-person attendance of their churches decreased during the pandemic. That's not a surprise, but currently 6 out of 10 say that their church attendance is still low. And if you look at studies by Pew and others, many are predicting that there's not going to be sort of a return to when worship was at pre-pandemic numbers in person. So that means it's going to require a both and approach to worship. Lovett's going to pick up at this point and share with us some thoughts about where we need to start with worship today.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome to everyone. The starting point for working on worship attendance should be those who are attending now. Using your pre-pandemic attendance as the goal is not helpful. The pandemic merely accelerated an existing trend. Let's look at what was happening to attendance before the pandemic. Worship attendance was good in the 1990s. This slide shows figures for the Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and the Presbyterian Church USA. These changes in attendance may appear modest, but remember, these are denominations that had lost membership yearly, beginning in the mid-1960s. But things changed. Beginning in 2002, an attendance decline began that has continued every year since. The decline has been across the United States and Canada and among virtually every denomination. I call it a worship recession. It continued right into the pandemic. Many reasons are given for this dramatic decline. No one reason explains everything. Pastors tend to agree that a major reason is during this period, the definition of regular attendance changed. Whereas before, people who considered themselves regular attenders worshiped 3 or 4 times a month. Now, those same people still consider themselves regular attenders, but are likely to attend only once or twice a month. Then the pandemic hit. Where are we now? There's much variation among churches. The Pew Research Center in March of this year found that 2/3 of people who normally attended at least once a month had returned to worship, though not all in person. In-person numbers appear to have increased since March, but churches report a broad range of attendance now compared to before the pandemic, with most reporting something between 50 and 90% of pre-pandemic attendance. What might this mean? As mentioned earlier, pre-pandemic attendance is not the best standard. Most of your churches would have fewer in worship today if there had been no pandemic. I'm suggesting that your starting point is where you are now, and your focus is strictly on the future. Quite frankly, recapturing your past worship that reached fewer people every year is not a worthy goal. Here's my recommendation. Develop a standard for the future by which all plans are made. It should be bold and future-oriented. It should grow out of your mission and see all people as your constituency. Here's an example. You may improve on it. Our church will offer worship in such ways that engage ever more people with God's love through Jesus Christ. You see, without something like this, decisions will be based on preferences of those already there. Think about the questions you're facing. Do we continue offering virtual worship? Do we return to 2 services or stay with 1? Do we resume our choirs? Do we resume in-person delivery of gifts to first-time guests? Think how differently these questions will be answered if you do not have a common standard for such decisions. Now, Jessica will share what some are already doing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lovett, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to take a look now at 3 different aspects of worship that offer opportunities for increasing attendance. First, we'll take a look at some low-hanging fruit. Then we'll look at some new worship experiences, followed by special services. Let's consider for a moment some low-hanging fruit. The first I want us to look at is the worship aesthetic. Consider the space that you are worshiping in, the lighting, the sound, the seating, the live stream. How are people who are gathered experiencing hospitality? As you think about the worship aesthetic, it may be helpful to think about the 5 senses and to consider how people are experiencing worship by what they're seeing, what they're smelling, what they're hearing, what they're touching, and what they're tasting. Is communion and fellowship open to everyone? Are there gluten-free options? Next, we'll think about signage and accessibility. Do people know how to access worship virtually, or how to find the sanctuary once they arrive on your campus? Sometimes we get so familiar with our spaces, whether they be in person or virtual, that we forget our first-time visitors need some extra help in finding their way. I know some churches have changed the way in which they do virtual worship, and it's important to make sure that all of your constituents know where to find and how to access those services. Soon, we will be turning our attention in worship to Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany. And I encourage you to think about what changes you may need to make in order to share the joy of the season with those who worship in person and those who attend virtually. Last year, one of my former congregations actually decided to move the location of the Christmas tree in the sanctuary so that the folks who are watching and worshiping with us via the live stream would be able to see it. Next slide. Doug touched on this a moment ago, but we want to look at also some new worship experiences. Messy Church, a lot of churches are doing on a monthly basis. Messy Church is intentionally intergenerational. It is creative, hands-on. It can be done in person or via Zoom. Some congregations are doing Messy Church as a take-home in either a bag or a box. But it certainly moves us out of the pews and out of our traditional orders of worship into a more experiential worship that is often geared toward engaging families and young children. Another new worship experience is Fresh Expressions. Fresh Expressions share faith and meet people in their everyday lives. They're often formed around shared interests. I'm familiar of groups that meet and go hiking or kayaking or explore nature in a particular way. I started several years ago, along with a colleague, a fresh expression called Coffee, Kids, and Chaos, where we offered snacks and coffee, and caregivers, parents, grandparents, nannies brought the children they were caring for, and while the children played, the adults engaged in conversation. There are a lot of different ways that you can consider new worship experiences that can either happen in person, out in your community, in your church building, or on various virtual platforms. Next, we'll take a look at some special services. This fall has been a season of many animal blessings, often scheduled around the feast of St. Francis. If you missed out on having an animal blessing this fall, you might consider having one around Earth Day. Several years ago, I was working with a pastoral team, and we hosted an animal blessing service on our church property, but we invited a veterinary clinic to offer a free rabies clinic. And we partnered with other entities in our community, including the sheriff's office, who came and offered a demonstration with their canine unit. And the local Humane Society came and offered an adoption event. And we collected an offering of towels and bedding and toys and dog and cat food and money. And our offering went to support the work of the Humane Society. It featured also a personalized blessing for each pet. And these days, I would invite folks who are joining virtually to either share a photo or share the name of their pet in the chat so that a blessing could be offered for them as well. During the pandemic, the congregations I was serving at the time were really missing out on singing Christmas carols. So we developed a program that we called Carols and Cocoa. And we invited folks to join us on Zoom. And last year, we actually were able to do this in person. And we gathered together and we sang Christmas carols and offered some readings. And everyone had the opportunity to enjoy some cocoa and some treats. And it was a wonderful way of celebrating And we started thinking about how we could take that celebration out into our community and perhaps pop up at a local venue, a Christmas tree farm, the local mall, or to share what we were doing via a live stream. It doesn't take a whole lot of resources, simply some hot cocoa, some song sheets. And of course, you want to be sure to include your invitation to join you for worship services during Advent and Christmas. Several years ago, I was serving a congregation in New York City, and one of the things that the congregation had noticed was that many of its constituents were out of town over Christmas and missed participating in our Christmas Eve service. This was, of course, before we were doing virtual worship. And so they started a tradition called Travelers Christmas Eve that usually happened a week or two before Christmas. And it was a candlelight Christmas Eve service designed just like any other Christmas Eve service, but it was offered several weeks in advance so that those who were traveling or working or with family on Christmas Eve would have the opportunity to celebrate. Other special services that you might consider, in addition to a blessing of the animals, I've seen congregations do a blessing of the boats, blessing of the bikes, blessing of new drivers as young people are getting their licenses, blessings of backpacks as folks are headed back to school, blessings of lunch boxes and work bags for teachers and other educators. There are any number of ways that you can celebrate various folks in your community as well as in your congregation. Another trend in worship has been to develop services that celebrate particular communities, such as veterans or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or first responders. When I was serving several years ago in a cooperative parish context, we took every month where there was a fifth Sunday and we did something special and different. There are usually about 4 or 5 fifth Sundays a year. So take those as an opportunity to try new things in worship. Do a community service plunge, do a day of service, worship in a local park or outside or in a public space, or join intentionally with other congregations. Now I'll hand things back over to Lovett so he can talk more about growing worship attendance.
Thank you, Jessica. We turn now to ways to grow attendance through paying attention. These ideas come from Overflow, a book in which Tom Berlin and I encourage pastors and church leaders to think of paying attention as a spiritual discipline. A good place to begin is to pay attention to the best practices of churches in which worship attendance is growing. These churches universally spend much time in planning for worship, long-term and weekly. They plan well ahead and they do detailed planning for each service. They devote far more time each week than other churches do in preparing for the Sunday services. And they regularly evaluate and revise. This includes a review of each service, but also more overall reviews regularly. This last point is especially critical for virtual offerings. We don't have 10 or 20 years of experience in virtual offerings. Therefore, there must be feedback and review every week with one goal in mind. How can we improve what we are doing before next week? You can get feedback from those who worship online, but don't stop there. View the services yourself and ask others who attend in person to view the online services. Ask them to identify ways to improve. Watch yourself and ask others to watch online services from other churches who do this well. The task is always the same. We don't need to know what we do better than they do. We must learn what they do better than we do. Here's some other things to which you need to pay attention. What happens in the first 2 minutes? These minutes are critical. Once gone, you can never get them back. They set the tone and define who you are. Usually the pastor introduces themselves, welcomes everyone, especially guests, and tells who the church is, not just by name, but identity. If your church has a heart for the community, say that. If it is a mission church, say that. You may be speaking to a small number of people, but act as if you're speaking to thousands. Set a positive and expectant tone. No rambling, no announcements, no commentary on the weather. Stick with the task. Pay attention to those participating. You may need to watch a video to do this, perhaps a video focused on the congregation. Who participates in the service and who doesn't? When is the energy level high or low? When does everyone seem engaged? And when does their attendance wander? Pay attention to those leading the service. You may preach about the diversity of God's creation, but if everyone who leads looks alike, your words won't stick. Remember, people hear what they see. Pay attention to the tone of the service. When people are asked what words describe worship at their churches, those from growing churches normally say joyful or hopeful. Those from declining churches normally say reverent. Pay attention to those who are present. If you keep track of who gives money to your church, keep track of who attends, for good or bad. Most of you are in churches where such tracking is not difficult. You or others can easily check off those present once the service is over. For larger churches, it's more of a challenge, but not impossible. You can't improve something if you don't know who is attending and how often. Pay attention to those who are visiting. Most of us have follow-up plans for first-time guests. That's important, but that's not what I'm talking about. There is one critical statistic that virtually no churches know. It is, in the past year, what percentage of first-time guests return for a second time? If you don't know, you must begin tracking. Just paying attention will teach you a lot. Before long, you will begin to see who comes back and who doesn't, and what the groups have in common. Trust me, the second time visit percentage is telling. Pay attention to those who are missing. As a pastor in Mississippi, I went to a new church one June. During the summer, I held 35 listening sessions with just 2 questions. One is relevant here. I said, some of you have lived here all your lives. All of you have lived here longer than I have. So I need your help with this question. When we gather for worship on Sundays, who's missing? That's our focus here. Who are the people God has given us in our communities that are not in our churches? Here's a list of groups of people that are more present in the general population than in our churches. Young adults, singles, racial groups different from the church majority, youth, children, men, Now, pay attention to a group you hope to reach. Don't begin with planning to do something. You must first learn. What are their concerns? What are their values? What are their needs? From whom can we learn? For example, if you have one single parent in your congregation, but there are many in the community, the beginning point is the single parent you know. That person is more likely than anyone else in the church to know other single parents from which you can learn. In addition to talking with those you hope to reach, leaders within your congregation need to be engaged. Let them help shape plans they will need to make this goal a reality. But you must have a ground rule, repeated at the beginning of every such conversation. The ground rule is that no one can say anything negative about the group being discussed. The reason is that if the people you're seeking to reach were there themselves, that's not how they would describe themselves. That's not how they see themselves. And unfortunately, church people just can't resist repenting for other people's sins. And now, Matt will guide us in our question time.
Hi, we've got a few questions that have come through the chat, some really good questions. So I'm looking forward to the answers. What would you say to churches that are in diverse communities? Should they set a new standard that from now on, the church will offer worship and programming that celebrates the cultures and diversity in their own communities?
Oh, I'm happy to begin. I think this is where a clear statement of what you're seeking to do matters. For example, I know a church that 10 years ago set a goal of becoming a church that represents God's rainbow of diversity. And they set up an inclusivity committee to work on that. And they've reported to the church every year, and they've done admirable things. They've had choir exchanges and pulpit exchanges. They've had studies of white racism. They have participated in the community diversity fair. There are many, many things that they've done. Unfortunately, after 10 years of this, their congregation no more resembles the community in which they're located than they did 10 years ago. Here's a suggestion for a church like that. Instead of setting what may be unrealistic goals, set something that's simple, but that requires you to give careful attention. For example, what if you said, we will do our ministry as a congregation in the coming year so that our congregation will be more representative of the community 1 year from now than it is now. Now, immediately some will say, oh, that's not bold enough. That's not ambitious. It is. For example, remember, you don't need to think about first, what do we need to do? You don't know enough to know what to do. If you knew what to do, you would have done it in the past 10 years. So you need to learn something. And so the first thing you need to learn is what is the makeup of our community? And then the next thing you have to learn is what's the makeup of our congregation. And who are those constituencies, those people God has given us in the community that we reach very well? Let's celebrate that. Let's ask how we do so well, why that's the case. And then what about others? And then that statement then can, instead of becoming the mission of a task group, you set up a task group and say, go find some more diverse people. No, you use it as a lens through which the whole church looks at its ministry. You ask every area to look at their ministry in the coming year through the lens of how can we do our work in the next year that makes it more likely that we will be serving a constituency more representative of our community 1 year from today than we are today. That's where you get synergy. That's where you get change. And that's where you hold yourself accountable to be fruitful for those good intentions that you have.
Thank you so much, Lovett. A question related to that, coming from the opposite side, we want to be welcoming of everyone in the community, but how do you talk about diversity in the congregation that is lacking in diversity?
I'm happy to start and let Lovett and Jessica jump in. I think that, again, Lovett's beginning a point of what do we need to learn is critical. That oftentimes what happens in congregations, we begin with a committee meeting talking about diversity and what we would like to see in the congregation, but we're talking among ourselves, and that's not helping us to actually achieve that which we're trying to do. If we really want to move towards this goal, it's going to require us getting out to the community and talking to those in the community who do not look like us, and being in conversation about why is it that you haven't considered our particular congregation for worship if they are individuals who are going to church, and just sort of getting that information and finding those things out and learning what it would mean for you to diversify. And it might mean starting with simple community events, gatherings where you can start building those relationships and not immediately starting with inviting people to worship. But the key is going to be building those conversations and relationships with people in the community. To start that process of trying to diversify is not going to be the congregation itself holding those conversations. The challenge is that we often talk about things and do studies in our congregations, but we never actually get out to practice the very thing that we're trying to attempt. And Lovett and Jessica, I don't know if you want to add.
Well, I might say, excuse me, that in dealing with your congregation, remember that it's better to start with the presumption of grace, because if you are strictly negative, you may force people to get defensive and cling more closely to their values. So if you say, that I know we're exclusive church, I know we're have a terrible history, and but now that I'm here, we're going to see the light and be what we ought to be, that they won't say we have sinned. That will they will be very defensive. Instead, you say, I am so honored to be the pastor of a church that welcomes everyone, a church that has been committed to this community from the beginning, and even as the community has changed, our commitment hasn't changed. Now, you may not be able to prove that scientifically then, but you assume the best until people prove you otherwise. You help give people a story. You can do that in the welcome. This is a church that from its beginning has been welcoming. And it's not a narrow welcome. It's a welcome for all. And you will find a church here that will accept you. You see, you get the point. Try to be as positive, give people a story, and help people then live into that. Sometimes you have to name something before it's a reality, but you have to do more than name it. You have to be working on those specific steps to make that a reality as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weems. I now have what must be the million-dollar question of the pandemic. Is there a preferred or recommended online worship platform that is user-friendly and will reach the most people? Facebook Live, YouTube, Discord, Twitch?
I can start and invite Doug and Lovett to jump in. I think a key in deciding which platform you're going to use is to know who is your audience. When you consider, if you want to reach young people, you're going to find them not really using Facebook anymore. You're going to find them on YouTube. So know your audience and make your decisions that way. A lot of congregations these days seem to be streaming on multiple platforms so that they can reach multiple audiences. Mm-hmm. Some are using their own websites for broadcasting the services so that you're directing people to the website. I think others are using Zoom so that folks who are gathering virtually can interact with one another. But then the service is also being streamed to Facebook Live or to YouTube. So it's really about considering your audience, who you're trying to reach, and the best way to reach them. I know of one congregation where most of their folks who are worshiping from home are on the phone. And so using something like Zoom or free conference call works more easily for them so that they can call in and listen to the service. Doug or Lovett, do you have more to add?
The only thing I would add is going back to something Lovett lifted up earlier. It's important to evaluate, especially if you're using multiple platforms, so that if you're using, for example, Facebook and YouTube, make sure you're evaluating if you are actually reaching your intended audience, so that if your goal is to reach younger individuals, but what you're finding out is that you're getting sort of low turnout on YouTube and a high turnout on Facebook, then the likelihood is that you're still probably reaching a higher age group than you intended. That's not a negative thing, but it just means then you need to evaluate sort of what it is that you're trying to accomplish and if you're actually reaching that goal. So the evaluation process is critical, particularly if you're using multiple platforms.
Thank you so much. How can folks gather information and contacts from the people watching on live streams? It's been a challenge for a lot of churches.
One thing that I've seen congregations do is share a QR code so that folks can scan it with their phone or device that then takes them to a page where they can enter the information. Similarly, other congregations put a link in the chat or the comments so that folks can click there and submit their information. I think it's key when you do these things to just be sure that you're inviting people to share, to either click the link or scan the code so that they will hopefully follow those invitations.
And the only thing I would add is there are some congregations who have sort of a virtual host that when people are coming in, welcomes those individuals, and also then if they can find it appropriate, can gather that information of who is joining, so that it doesn't have to be a clergy person who does this. This could be a lay person who sort of has a gift for hosting online, and that person may be very different than an in-person host. But a person who can sort of act as a virtual host can also be a way to gather that information.
Great. Thank you so much. Here's a good question. Can you further explain the messy church concept? I'm not sure I get it, and I'm sure a lot of people don't.
Let me say that we also, on the resources we're going to be sending to you, included a podcast with Johanna Myers, who's a part of Messy Church. So I highly recommend that you listen to that podcast. But Messy Church is approach to worship is intergenerational. And the goal is to think about how to construct worship for all generations together, particularly focusing on sort of art. So the idea is to involve all individuals around something they can build together to tell the story, and not sort of think about planning worship sort of in the top-down model that we often use in our congregations. So if you are interested in sort of intergenerational worship, where it's more organic and planned, where the generations are coming together and building something that tells the gospel story, Messy Church might be something that may be of interest to you. And I don't know if Lovett and Jessica want to add to it.
I think listening to the podcast is a great idea, and really thinking about Messy Church moving away from worship in the sanctuary, worship where everybody is in their seat in the pew. It's very hands-on, interactive. Folks may be drawing or coloring a picture together. They may be acting out the biblical story as they're reading it, or building something with Legos or other blocks. But it's a highly interactive form of worship.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anschutz. Another question. Some new ideas can make long-term members uncomfortable, which doesn't make the service seem worshipful in their view. How do we find a balance between new ideas and more traditional concepts of what constitutes a worship service?
Lovett, I was thinking of you in this one.
Well, all of this is very, very relative. I remember my first church out of seminary, and after a few weeks, people were complaining, saying, we'd really like to sing some of the old hymns. And I was thrilled. I thought they were talking about 3rd or 4th century, or no, they were talking about Fanny Crosby and 75 years ago. Someone left church one Sunday and said to a pastor, I don't like guitars in church. And the pastor said, that's exactly what people said when the organ was introduced. Keep the organ in the bars where they belong, So, it's helpful to help people put things in perspective in terms of how things have changed really in their lifetimes. Or if you've got people who've ever have been in other churches, you can build on that. Some of you have said that you've been in other churches in the past and things were done a little differently. And but then somehow, the more you change, the more you want to focus on continuity. And so you can focus on what's staying the same, or you can find ways to link it. And that could be with the people who give leadership to the change. It could be with somehow connecting it to something that the church has been before. But the most important thing always is you've got to connect everything to your mission. And that's another reason for having a good mission statement for what you're doing in worship. Otherwise, it will get back to just preferences. Now, during the pandemic, we discovered a lot of things. We discovered things that we're spending money on that we really didn't need to spend money on. We discovered things we were doing that we really didn't need to do. But we also got rid of some things that saved a lot of people some time and energy and effort. And so if your standard going forward is simply, do we do this or that, there could be a tendency that I'm seeing in some congregations, among some staffs, even among some pastors, to say, well, maybe we don't go back to that, or maybe we don't do this. Now, that's wonderful if it didn't help us reach more people, if it didn't help us fulfill our mission more. But it's not, if it's just a matter of convenience or preference. Therefore, whatever we do, whatever change, is not for the change, it's for the mission. And so you are the steward. As a church leader, you're a steward of the mission. And that's the only reason you would be about considering a change at all. And so you want to assume that's where other people are. Now, remember, assume the best until people prove you otherwise. It's like people saying they want a church where everyone knows your name, you know? Well, but that's not a mission statement. That's kind of a comfort statement or a preference. And so you can't say to people, get over that. But what you can say is, even yourself, you can acknowledge that change is hard for you sometimes. And then I start thinking, but God has more for us as a church. God has called us to something very special for this time. And if this will help us reach one person that we're all praying for and hoping to reach, then my little discomfort will be a small price to pay for that. But wrap yourself into that circle and connect whatever you do with the mission, the vision of the congregation. Assume they share that commitment and move forward as positively as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Weems. Another question: how do you get current people who worship regularly from lamenting the absence of people who are not returning? Sometimes these folks are very negative.
That is, I'll begin. I mean, that's a big challenge, and it's a big challenge, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and just goes to the statistics we shared earlier. And I think that we're going to have to do a couple of things. One is, of course, continue to pray for people to be connected, whether it's in person or virtually. So that we can't simply, again, think about it one-dimensional, but pray for people to stay connected. And then we got to help individuals to understand that some individuals are going to make a choice not to come back in person and may join the community virtually, and that's okay. That as Lovett talked about, that throughout life, there are things that happen that sort of change our rhythms of what happened, and we lament the way things were before, but it doesn't necessarily mean what is happening now or what will happen in the future is negative. It just means that it shifts the way that we will have to engage. So it may mean that instead of seeing some of those individuals every Sunday in person, that we will have to connect with those individuals through Zoom or through some other means. And that helping our congregation to understand that having the connection is still important with those individuals, and that we are not losing the individual, even if they are not there with us in person. It is going to be a challenge, and it's going to continue to be a challenge because this is still all very new for all of us. It's hard to imagine moving from a time when we all gather together in a space together to now some of us won't be in that space. But helping the congregation see that in many cases, those individuals are still connecting with us. And in some cases, some congregations are gaining back people who have moved away to other states or places who are now able to connect. So reminding them of those gains also of individuals who were disconnected from us previously are also important.
I'll add that sometimes you can engage those people who are lamenting the absence into doing the outreach to reach out to some of the people who are missing. And in some cases, the people who are really frustrated about folks who aren't returning, they may be particularly frustrated or missing a particular family, a particular person, someone that they considered a friend or a contact. And so it may be simply encouraging folks to reach out, to send a card, make a phone call to folks that they haven't seen, and help to make those connections, whether they're back to in-person worship or virtual opportunities.
Yes, think about it this way. In the early days of radio, some very prominent churches and pastors were invited to have their services broadcast on radio for free. And many of those turned that offer down because their thinking was, if people can listen to the service at home, why would they come to church? Well, the churches that did permit their services to be broadcast on radio did not lose people, they gained people. Now, it's too early to know what the future of virtual worship is in relationship to in-person worship. But it does open you to a world of possibilities that you did not have before. if you see it as a cutting edge, if you see it as a growth, as a new service you've started for growth, and you can reach those people. It may begin by being family members or people who grew up there or former members, but it may expand to pick up some people in your own community or from other communities that have some reason to find you online. And then you build on that. There are things served by what's going on in in-person worship that goes beyond just hearing the sermon or singing the songs. And that's why radio did not empty the churches and television didn't empty the churches. And if churches have fewer people today, and they do, it will not be changed by getting rid of online options. So you can celebrate those who are there and celebrate those who have reasons not to be there. And again, stay positive. Don't get discouraged and down yourself. And as I said before, don't look to past levels, but look at where you are, celebrate who is there, and go forward with that.
Thank you so much. We will have to wrap up our questions, but if I wasn't able to get to your questions, please email me and I'll pass it along to Dr. Powe, Dr. Anschutz, and Dr. Weems. My email address is in the chat. If you'd like more information, resources, and strategies from the Lewis Center, the leader in church leadership, please visit our website at churchleadership.com. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas. Listen and watch Leading Ideas Talks podcast episodes on YouTube, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I will add these resources in the chat window in just a moment, and I'll also include them in the email you will receive later today. Also, your opinion is important to us. Please help us build better webinars by letting us know what worked and what could have worked better. Please complete an evaluation at churchleadership.com/evaluation. Thank you so much in advance for your feedback. Again, that's churchleadership.com/evaluation. And we are pleased to announce an upcoming webinar, Let Mission Shape Your Worship. Dr. Weems will take what we've learned today and look deeper into the relationship between mission and worship. You'll learn how your church can plan worship in ways that celebrate and advance God's mission for your church. Dr. Weems will share practical skills that can be adapted to fit your particular church context. Webinar is Tuesday, November 15th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern, and the cost is $35. Learn more and register now at churchleadership.com/webinar22. And thank you so much for attending this webinar today. Later, you will receive an email with links to the webinar slides, additional resources, and the complete results of the Pandemic Worship Survey. And as soon as we formatted the webinar video recording, we'll email that to you as well. Once again, please complete an evaluation at churchleadership.com. And finally, from all of us at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for attending. We know your time is valuable, and we sincerely appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. Blessings to you and all that you do.